Bright QT. Every student matters.
So these are the specific features when it comes to England and the beginning of feudal structure there. Now the focus of the chapter is on changing relations between lords and vassals, that is tenants in chiefs or nobles. How this relationship changes over time period. So we know history is all about tracing this change because nothing is stagnant or nothing happens without change. Change is inevitable. And here too, we focus and trace this change in this structure of the society. So the first important is environmental changes. There are different categories of change. So the first category we look at is environmental changes. So during the period between 5th and 10th century, a large part of Europe was covered with lush forests. So this is the time period before the period which we have in focus, because we have almost 9 to 16 centuries while we are dealing with the chapter. So the here the effort is to see what was happening before, that is the 5th to around 10th century. Large part of Europe was covered with forest, and the land available for agriculture was very limited because there was full of forest. The peasants, dissatisfied with their conditions of work, could easily flee from oppression and escape to the forest. So another disadvantage for the lords was this, that peasants who were exploited and who had to work hard and give all kind of services to the lord and who were left with no other choice, many times decided to flee to the forest to free themselves from the oppression. So Europe was undergoing very harsh cold climatic spell during this period, that is from 5th to 10th century. The climate was also very harsh and hard and not suitable for agriculture. This brought prolonged winters, that is long winters, shorter growing season for crops, reduction of agricultural produce. So as a result, there was reduction of agricultural produce. They could not produce as much as the need was. And in the 11th century, Europe's climate became warm. So now comes the period which is our focus in this chapter, that is by 11th century, a positive change is happening, that is climate is becoming warm. And there was increase in average temperature which had a deep effect on agriculture. And increase in average temperature becomes a positive change and helps in agricultural improvement. The peasants now had a longer growing season. So the growing season increased and the soil was now subjected to less frost because the winters were now becoming short. The land could now be easily plowed or cultivated. The environmental historians, the historians who study the environmental changes, have noted that the forest area was considerably reduced in many parts of the continent. So now the forest area comes down or gets small by the 11th century. And as a result of these changes, we see the land use also changes by the 10th, 11th century. Initially, agricultural technology was primitive. So we did not have much advanced agricultural technology in hand. The peasants formerly, that is in the past times, used wooden plows driven by oxen to plow the land. These plows could not till the surface of the land deeply. So this wooden plows, it had many limitations. It could not go into the deep surface of the soil. As a result, the peasants could not draw out the natural productivity of the soil So because it could not plow deep, it was difficult to make the soil suitable for agriculture, or the natural productivity could not be attained. Agriculture therefore required hard labor. So whoever was working on the field had to put in a lot of effort because of limited technological development. The peasants had to dig the fields by hand, generally once in 4 years. So now, once in 4 years, the peasants had to manually dig the soil. So the method of crop rotation was faulty. So another method which was followed by the peasants, which was crop rotation, also had several limitations, or it followed a false pattern. That is, it is estimated that only 1/2 or 50% of land was cultivated every year, leaving the other half uncultivated. This was known as twofold system. So the agricultural practice prevalent was a twofold system, where only one part of the land was cultivated and other was left fallow, but it was not an effective method. According to it, a strip of land was cultivated in a given year, leaving the other strip fallow, and then in the following year, the former was left fallow and the later was brought under cultivation. So always a part of land was left fallow under the twofold system of cultivation. This system slowly deteriorated the soil. So because of this system, the soil productivity was getting deteriorated. As a result, famines became common. So because of the deterioration or going down or disimprovement of the soil, it resulted in famines and going down of soil productivity. And the chronic malnutrition of the peasants and famines made the lives of poor more miserable. So it was getting very hard for the peasants to manage in this harsh conditions, because there was no technological advancement, and there was a lot of labor which was to be involved in farming, and the production or the productivity was very less, which led to famine like situation where peasants had to live a very hard and miserable life. The lords did not care to remove the hardships of the cultivators. Interestingly, the lords who made the peasants work on their fields never bothered about the difficulties which the peasants were going through, how miserable their lives were. They were only anxious to increase their own incomes. The only focus of the rich landlord or the nobles and the tenants in chiefs were to increase their profit and income. As it was not possible to increase the output from the land, the peasants had no option but to bring the whole manorial estate under cultivation. So the peasants were forced to work more hard and bring all the land under the manorial estate for cultivation. So it was increasing the burden on the peasants. They had to spend more time on land than they were legally bound to do. So although as per the contract signed between the lord and tenant, there were specific hours of work which the tenant had to do on the field of the lord. But because the productivity was so low, the peasants were forced to bring all the land under the manorial house to cultivation, and as a result, they ended up working more hours than it was required. The peasants could not tolerate this oppression, so the peasants found it very oppressive and hard to bear. As it was impossible for them to openly protest, they adopted the method of passive resistance. So to openly protest was very hard because it was difficult for the poor peasant to challenge the supremacy of the Lord. But what they did was they resisted in a passive form, not directly, but in indirect ways. So the indirect ways included paying more attention to cultivating of their lands and avoid performing unpaid services to their lords. So whenever they could, what the peasants did was they gave more attention to cultivation of their own lands. And in a half-hearted or a passive way, took care of the land of the Lord. So these were indirect ways of showing their discontent. So sometimes the peasants also had conflicts with the lords over pastures and forest land. So pastures and forest lands and the ownership of it was also something which was which there was conflict over. And many times whenever the lords tried to make it their private property, the peasants opposed, because these were not supposed to be private property, and peasants considered the pastures and forest lands to be used by the whole community. It was not a private property of the lord, but it was a common property who where everybody had rights over. So another change which comes is changes in agricultural technology. So we saw the environmental changes happening. So environmental changes we saw from 5th to 10th century, how there were most areas were lush forests, and then from 11th century onwards, how there are changes in the environment and the lessening of forest area and improvement of climate, which helps in improving the agricultural productivity. And then we saw when it came to agriculture, how people had to rely on wooden plow, and then how people or the peasants had to work hard to get any kind of yield. Now the change which happens is changes in agricultural technology by 11th century. Similar to the environmental changes, by 11th century, there are improvements in agricultural technology also. This is very important and significant development which is happening in Europe in the 11th century. So during the 11th century, many changes came in agricultural technology. The cultivators now began to use heavy and new iron-tipped plows in place of wooden plow. See, we had seen that wooden plows were very ineffective. It did not go deep into the soil. Now came heavy and new iron plows. So these iron plows were more effective than the wooden plows. The new plows could dig the soil much deeper. This is very significant, and this method of plowing helped utilizing the nutrients from the soil. So now the nutrients which were deep under the soil could be resurfaced, and it became very useful for agriculture. There was improvement in methods of harnessing animals to the plow. So when animals were used to carry out the plowing activities, there were improvements in the technologies used for this. That is, the shoulder came into use in the place of neck harness. So instead of tying the plowing equipment to the neck, now the shoulder could be used, and new technologies developed which helped in harnessing these plowing materials, and this helped animals to exert great power. So in a way, this technological change helped us or the peasants in using animals in a much more useful way. And we see that the horses were now better shoed with iron horse shoes, thus preventing foot decay. Another technological improvement is the iron shoes for horses, which helped or which kind of prevented food decay, which was prevalent among horses before this period. The wind and water energy were increasingly used for agriculture. Wind and water energy gets used. Water and wind powered mills were established almost in whole of Europe for milling corn and pressing grapes. So this is another technological improvement happening over this period. And the fold system of rotation of crops also changed. According to this system, farmer land holding was divided into 3 strips. So instead of two-fold system of rotation, we now see three-fold system of rotation of crops, where the holding was now divided into 3 different strips. In a year, only 2 strips were cultivated, leaving the third strip fallow. So the third strip was now left fallow, and the other strip, and this was how the threefold system of division or rotation of crops was carried out. So this method of leaving the land fallow was adopted because they thought that the strip left fallow would regain fertility during the rest of the year. So that's why one piece of the land was left fallow. But in the three-fold system, only a small piece of land had to be left fallow, unlike the two-fold system, where every year a large part of the land had to be left uncultivated. And as a result, there was an almost immediate increase in the amount of food production. So this is what the desired result was, that the food production improved more efficiently or in a very good way, and double production was available because of the environmental changes and the agricultural technological development. The result is that the production almost doubles by the 11th century. The greater use of plants like peas and beans provided proteins in their diets to the people and a better source of fodder for animals. So when there is more productivity, we see there are products like beans and peas, which is a rich source of protein both for animals and human beings. So unlike the famine-like situation in 5th to 10th century, there is a lot of improvement in diet of people, and as a result we know the health of both people and animals improve in this period. The cultivators could now produce more food from less land. The small holdings of land could be better cultivated with less labor force. So intensive labor was not needed. That is, labor intense, as in more labor to work on a field was not now required. Instead, less people would suffice because technology was of great assistance. The peasants could spend more time on other activities. So when the work of peasants became easy, they could now spend their time in other activities other than agriculture and tilling. Again, the peasants did not have enough money to set up water mills and windmills. So the first setup in this direction was taken by the lords. We know that the peasants were in poor economic conditions, so it was impossible for them to take money for setting up water mills and windmills. So they had to take help from lords who invested in these technological developments. The peasants took initiative in extending arable land. What the peasants did was they increased the land under cultivation, and they also began the threefold rotation of crops, which we already saw, and set up small forges and smithies in the village where iron tipped plows and iron shoe for horses were made cheaply. So they invested in activities which helped them improve the technological developments or interventions which made the agricultural activity all the more effective. And in the 11th century, the personal bonds between lords and vassals, which formed the basis of feudalism, weakened because of the expansion of the economy. So if you remember, in this topic we are dealing with the relationship between lord and the vassals, right? That's when we started with the changes which is happening, the change in the relationship between lord and vassal. And that's when we talked about environmental changes, agricultural technological changes, and other subsequent consequences of it. And we now see, by the time we come to the 11th century, the personal bond between the lord and vassal diminishes. And this is important because this bond is most integral or very important to the feudal structure. The whole feudal structure, which is organized in a pyramidical form, is dependent on the relationship between the lord and the tenant, beginning from the king to the cultivator. And by 11th century, this relationship is weakening because of the expansion of the economy. And the economy is expanding because agriculture is improving, the yield is improving, and everything related to it is undergoing a drastic change. So money transactions had become more common. The lords now began to ask for rent in cash and not in services. So with the expansion of economy, money transaction becomes all the more improved, and the lords are now asking for transaction in money than in service. So the increasing use of money began to affect prices, which became higher in times of poor harvest. So the increasing circulation of money affects the prices, which becomes higher when in times of crisis or poor harvest. And one example of this is that in England, the agricultural prices doubled between 1207 and 1320. So in the 13th, 14th century, as a result of all these changes along with agricultural expansion, what we see is agricultural prices doubled in the period between 13th and 14th century. And another important development happening as a result of all these changes which we now discussed is growth of new towns and the emergence of fourth order. So the expansion in agriculture led to the growth of three things. The three major things which is happening is population, trade, and towns. So the expansion of agriculture, which we saw how it happened by 11th century, now we see that it leads to the growth in three areas, which are population, trade, and towns. And during the period 1200 and 1300, the population of Europe increased from 62 million to 73 million. So we see because of improvement in diet and advancement in technology and expansion of agriculture, there is a rise in population. By the 14th century. And there was also increase in life expectancy of the people. So the lifespan is also getting expanded due to availability of better food. We saw how protein-rich food become all the more available. And as men got better food to eat, their life expectancy became more than that of women and girls. So the first beneficiaries of these changes are men who are now getting better food and whose lifespan is improving compared to other weaker sections of the society like women and girls. And from the 11th century, towns again began to grow. So as a result of the changes, we see another important development, that is growth of towns. So the peasants who had surplus grain to sell needed such places where they could sell their produce and purchase tools and clothes. So the peasants who now had surplus, because there is expansion of agriculture and productivity. So after meeting their needs, they had certain amount of grain to be sold in the market, because after selling it only they received money which they could now use for meeting other needs like tools and clothes. And first, it led to the growth of periodic fairs and then small marketing centers, which gradually developed into towns. So important is that it's not that one fine day there emerged big towns, but it also happens in a step-by-step manner. When people find that peasants are now having money to purchase clothes and tools, they come to the village areas, and periodic fairs or markets are established in certain days, and then later on it becomes marketing centers, and from there those marketing centers emerge as big towns where a number of transactions happen. So the town had a town square. So this town is another important and interesting place which is getting emerged. So it had a town square, a church, and roads, and the merchants built shops and homes, and an office where those governed could sit together. So these merchants, who are important category which emerge as a result of this change, also established themselves in the towns, which consisted of a church and a town square where there took place a lot of transactions in trade and other economic activities. So some towns grew around large castles, bishops' estates, or large churches. So wherever we had big bishops' houses and large churches, it was a suitable space for the emergence of town, because it was a place where people in large numbers came together. So that was the best suitable place for emergence of big towns and carrying out of trade and economic activities. So in the towns, people paid a tax to the lords. So here again, people had to pay tax to the lords who owned the land on which the town had grown. So the merchants and others who settled down in towns for carrying out trade activities, they had to pay tax to the lord on whose land the town was established. The town offered the opportunity to get paid work and freedom from landlord's control over young people from peasant families. So now towns were an alternative setup from the fields. So whoever found the manorial estates and the work there very hard and difficult opted to come out of those manual estates and work in the towns. So town now emerged as an alternative setup. Many freemen escaped from their lord's domain. So we see that many freemen escaped from their lord's domain and settled in the towns. So whoever found the work in the manors and in their estates very hard, flee to the towns. They provided unskilled labor to the towns, and the shopkeepers and merchants needed individuals with specialized skills like bankers and lawyers. So the merchants who were getting established needed people to look after their accounts, their banking needs, and they also wanted lawyers. So now there were alternative occupations which were emerging, which till then was not available to people. So because till then all people in the peasant class had to work hard on the soil and they could not think of any other option. But by the 11th century, because of the technological changes, economic changes, and other developments, we see another alternative space emerge for the poor peasants, that is, the towns, where they could free themselves from the agricultural activities and come to and settle down. So that's the importance of the emergence of towns and the merchant class in the 11th century. So the big town had population of about 30,000, and these town people could be said to have emerged as the fourth order. So although the prominent section is the three orders, that is the clergy, the nobility and the peasantry, by 11th century a new section emerges who can be called the fourth order. That's the town people, which consisted of merchants. So now there were guilds or associations or unions of townsmen. So this guilds is another important category, which is association of townsmen or merchants. And each craft or industry was organized into a guild. So whoever was involved in any kind of trade activity or in manufacturing activities, like potters and blacksmiths and carpenters and masons, all of those who were involved in a particular kind of craftsmanship were called the guilds. I mean, they formed or organized themselves into different units, and this name, the guild, was given to that particular set of people who organized themselves and who belonged to the same occupation or who followed somewhat the same occupation. And it controlled the quality of the produce, its prices, and its sale. So the guild organization controlled the quality of prices, quality of the produce, the prices, and its sale. So that was why the guilds were formed, to keep a control and check over the production. And every town had a guild hall, which was a building for ceremonial functions. The heads of the guilds met there formally. So every guild formation had a head, and different heads of different guilds took this guild hall as a place where they could meet frequently. And there were guards who patrolled the town halls. So the towns, there were guards who went around these town halls as guarding these towns and then other town related areas. The musicians were called to play at the feast and in civic processions. So along with this, the musicians were called to play and be part of civic processions which happened in towns frequently. There were inns in the towns where innkeepers looked after the travelers. And in the towns, another important setup was inns or lodges, where people from far off places, when they were involved in trade, could come stay and then carry out their tasks and then go back. So in the 11th century, we see that the development of a new trade route with West Asia also gets discovered in this period. This is another important development, that is, new trade routes are getting discovered in this period. And with the growth of towns, the trade also flourished. The townsmen become rich and prosperous, and they now rival the power of the nobility. So when towns emerge, the trade also flourishes because these are things which are closely related, towns and trade. And we see the townsmen become rich and prosperous, and they now rival the power of nobility. So the old structures or the old class orders are now getting diminished. The power of the nobility is getting diminished when the townspeople, the merchants, are becoming more powerful by the 11th century. So these are significant changes which are happening by the 11th century in Europe, and the reflections of it could be seen in other parts of the world too. So now we look at the rise of cathedral towns. So the cathedral towns are an important phenomenon which develops in this period which we are now focusing on. And we see that in the 12th century, large churches called cathedrals were being built with donations of rich merchants. So by the 11th, 12th century, another important development which is happening is development or the building of large churches. So the large churches are called cathedrals. And it is built mainly with the donations which the church received from rich merchants. Because we saw by the 11th century, towns are coming into being and are developing, and the merchant class are now becoming very influential. And for them, donating money to the development of big churches is beneficial because it is in and around the church that they found feasible to build towns, because a lot of people came to the church, and those people were helpful in improving their trade activities. So the cathedrals were built of stone and took many years to complete. So mostly all the cathedrals of the medieval period were built of stones, and it took a lot of time to complete because it was very large buildings or large churches which were getting built. When they were completed, they became the centers of pilgrimages. So important is that these churches were important centers of pilgrimages, and small towns developed around them. So now you see the merchants' interest in donating money to church. So when you have cathedrals, it is understood that people will flock or come to these cathedrals because they consider it very sacred and as their pilgrim centers, and it was important for the development of trade and rise of new towns in and around these new pilgrim places. So people in large numbers gathered in the hall of the cathedral. The monks sang religious songs, and their prayers could be heard from over a long distance. So these are all features of cathedrals where monks sang religious songs, and these songs were sung with loud voice which could be heard from a large distance. And most importantly, it gave rise to new towns around these cathedrals. And the stained glasses windows of the cathedral consisted of pictures narrating the stories of the Bible. Another important feature of this large cathedrals were that the windows had stained glasses, or it had pictures, glass paintings of important events in the life of Jesus Christ and also in Christianity. So for the illiterate people, because at this period there was a large section who were not literate, who didn't know how to read and write, for them the knowledge about Christianity or about their religion and about Jesus Christ came from these glass paintings which were drawn on the window glasses of the cathedral. So that's the developments which are majorly taking place in and around the time between 11th and 14th century. So if you remember, In the beginning of the chapter, we had started with the time that is around 9th century, which marked the death of the great emperor Charlemagne, and we saw how the political changes and the collapse of the central government leads to a new social formation or a new pattern of life which came to be known as feudalism. And then we saw the features of it and how it developed over the period from 9th to almost around 11th century. So this was the first focus. This time period is what we first focus on. And in the later part of the chapter, we come to the time period that is 11th to 14th century. And we saw how environmental changes and how agricultural technologies and new discoveries lead to certain other developments like rise of towns and the building of large cathedrals, and how trade activities flourish in this time period, and how as a result the lord vassal relation diminishes or gets weak in this period. And now we come to the 14th century, and there is a crisis which happens in this time period, and we'll now look closely at what this crisis was. So by the early 14th century, the economic expansion of Europe had slowed down due to various reasons. So the developments which are taking place between 11th and the 13th century are now getting weakened or is slowing down in the 14th century or by the 14th century. Firstly, some climatic changes come in northern Europe. So in the northern part of the European continent, we could see that by the 14th century, climatic changes are taking place. The warm summers of the previous years had given way to bitterly cold summers. So the warm summers of the previous year gave way to bitter cold. So now again there is a shortening of summer days, and the temperature is going down and it's becoming more cold. And seasons for growing crops were now getting reduced. So we saw till the 10th century the situation was same in Europe. It wasn't hot, and the temperature did not suit agriculture. It is only in the 11th century that we see temperature rises and there are more days which are hot, which then helps in agriculture. Similarly, in 14th century, the climatic changes happen in such a way that it is again becoming unsuitable for agriculture. The storms and oceanic floods ruined many farmsteads, which reduced the income of the government from taxes. So now there are frequent floods and storms, which also reduce the agricultural productivity. And the shortage of pasture lands reduced the number of cattle. So along with this, the pasture lands are also getting some kind of shortage, or it is getting small, and this affects the cattle and its number. And the population had increased, but the resources to feed the people was small. So at this time, we see that the population is getting increased, but there wasn't enough resources to feed all this population. And this resulted in the occurrence of famines in Europe between 1315 and 1317. So this is 17th century. This is the 14th century, that is 1315 to 1317. Again, famines occurred, like it happened in the 10th century. And productivity and agriculture is all going down. So this is one important change happening in the environmental arena. And then comes the second important development, that is trade was hit by a severe shortage of metal money. So now there is a severe shortage of money, and the trade which was flourishing between 11th and 13th century now goes down by the 14th century. And this happened due to shortage of supply of silver from Australia and Siberia. So now there is a shortage of supply of silver from Siberia and Australia, which leads to shortage of metal money. And the government was compelled to reduce the silver content of the coins. So as a result, the government had to reduce the silver content of the coins. And thirdly, now the third reason is that in the 13th and 14th centuries, ships carrying goods from distant land began arriving in the European harbors. So now when the trade had flourished, ships carrying goods from far away places had now started landing in European harbors. So you may think that why there is an issue with it. This is an important development and it is positive. It is because of the flourishing of the trade that goods from far away places are now coming to Europe. But there was a danger hidden in it, and it is that the ships were infested with rats. So the rats become the villain, that all the ships had rats in it. And this spread bubonic plague. So the rats from the faraway places, the ships got infested or infected with rats, and the rats led to spread of plague, which was called the bubonic plague, which was and led to a situation which is termed in history as Black Death. And it hit Western Europe very badly, leading to a great epidemic. And it is estimated that 20% people of whole Europe died of this disease within 3 years between 1347 and 1350. So by the mid 14th century, due to bubonic plague, around 20% of Europe's population disappears or dies. And the plague took its worst toll among infants, young, and elderly. So all the sections of the society were badly affected by the plague. Europe had a population of 73 million in 1300, and it got reduced to 45 million in 1400. So this is how there is a wiping off of a large number of population in Europe due to the bubonic plague, which brings down the population of Europe from 73 million to 45 million in a gap of 1 century. The decrease in population resulted in acute shortage of labor. So now the consequence of this decrease in population is acute shortage of labor, because there are very few people who are left, and the labor services are now going down because of lack of population. There were not enough people to work in the fields or industries. The prices of agricultural products dropped as there were very few people who could afford to buy the agricultural products. So the consequence of it would be seen in the prices of the agricultural products, which also dropped because of less demand for it. On the other hand, there was increase in wages because of the shortage of agricultural labor. And the consequence of this was increase of wages, which happened because of shortage of labor and cutting down of population. It happened especially in England. The surviving labor now demanded twice their earlier wage. So now the bargaining power of the labor increased because there were lack of population or very few people who were there in the labor market, and they started demanding more wages than they used to before. And as a result of all this development, there comes a social unrest. This is what is termed the 14th century crisis. The social unrest includes the decline in agricultural prices and increase in wages. So one is decline in agricultural prices, Another important development is increase in the wages, and these developments very badly hit the landlords, or it negatively impacted the landlords. The landlords desperately tried to give up money contracts they had entered into and revived labor services. So now they were in a very desperate position because there was a lot of pressure on them by the 14th century. But the peasants violently opposed it. So, whatever efforts the landlords were making to convince the peasants to continue to work on their fields, the peasants now used their bargaining power to oppose the landlords. There were peasant revolts in different parts of Europe, especially in France in 1358 and in England in 1381. So now peasants who were getting oppressed for a long time under the rule of the landlords and the feudal lords for the first time got a bargaining power and a power or a strength to retaliate or to oppose the decisions which the landlords were imposing on the peasants. And this peasant revolts or rebellions were severely crushed, but the sheer intensity of the peasant ensured that the old feudal relations could not be imposed again. And this becomes the most important development of the 14th century, that peasants now gain a bargaining power, and it now became very difficult for the landlords to exploit or continue exploiting the laborer class or the peasant class. So, as a result of all these developments, we see new political changes happening in the 14th century. So, the significant political development took place in 15th and 16th century, that is following the crisis of 14th century. By 15th and 16th century, several political developments are happening. The kings in European countries strengthened their military and financial powers. These kings have been styled as new monarchs. So by 15th century there is rise of the new monarchs. That is a different kind of dictators or kingship is arriving or arising or emerging in Europe by the 15th and 16th century. And these kings strengthened their military and financial powers in a different way. Rather than depending on the feudal structure, they designed new ways to strengthen their militia or military power. So the King of France, Austria, and England were absolute rulers. That is, now these rulers were getting more power and these rulers were establishing themselves as the final and the supreme authority. In England, King Henry VII, Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain, so Isabella and Ferdinand, the King and Queen of Spain, and Henry VII in England, organized their standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy, and national taxation systems. So by the 15th century, we see that these new monarchs or the absolute rulers are establishing or introducing certain new measures. One is an organized standing army. So this is very important. Unlike the rulers of the earlier centuries who depended on their tenants in chief and their knights, now these absolute or the new monarchs are establishing or organizing new standing armies or an organized standing army. And another development is a permanent bureaucracy is also getting established. And there is national taxation system. instead of depending on sub-infeudation of land and collection of taxes from different tenants, the kings are now establishing a new system of taxation on a national level. And the most important cause of the triumph of the monarchies were the social changes which had taken place in 12th and 13th centuries. So, as a result of the developments taking place in 12th and 13th centuries, it gave rise to new monarchs who now started organizing their whole empire in a different way than depending on the feudal structure anymore. And the weakening of the relation between feudal lords and the vassals and the slow rate of economic growth gave an excellent opportunity to the kings to assert their control over their subjects. So, by this time period, the power of the lords were getting weakened. The lords were becoming weak and their strength was going down or diminishing. And in such a circumstance, what the king or the absolute ruler did was he asserted control over all his subjects. So, this the kings took as an opportunity, especially the new monarchs and the absolute rulers took it as an opportunity to eliminate all those tenants or sublords, because in some way the king's power were getting divided among the lords under him. So, in order to regain or take back the central authority, the new kings used this crisis of 14th century as an opportunity to control or to take back or to reassert their control over the subjects and eliminate the sublords. The kings no more depended on feudal lords for their armies. Most importantly, the power of the feudal lords went down or completely got diminished, because now the kings were no more dependent on the lords for their armies. And they introduced their own armies, which were professionally trained and equipped with guns and siege artillery. This is very important, that the new organized armies coming up who were trained in using guns and artillery. The resistance of the lords and nobility vanished in the face of the firepower of the kings. So, although the lords tried to resist these changes, they couldn't do much, because the kings by now had absolute power over everything. So, now we look closely at this new category which emerged by the 15th century, that is, the new monarchs or the absolute rulers, that is, kings with absolute power and authority. So, the new monarchs had enough income to support large armies. This is something which we saw. That's why they were no more dependent on the feudal lords for army. They could defend and expand their frontiers, that is, their region or the kingdom's area could be expanded with the use of the organized army. They could also overcome internal resistance to the royal authority. So, whatever resistance which was coming to the royal authority from the side of the feudal lord and peasants could be taken down or could be resisted with the use of the strong army. And the aristocracy resisted the centralization of powers in the hands of monarchs. And in England and France, the kings had to wage long war against dukes and princes. So, in England and France, in order to retake or regain the centralized powers, the wars had to be organized, or wars had to be fought against dukes and princes, that is the noble class. So this aristocracy in the feudal time were, the nobility, that is the second order within the feudal structure, and they resisted the centralization of power. Under feudal system, there was decentralization of power. King had authority, but then his authority and power to a large extent was shared between other tenants in chief. That's how the whole pyramidical structure existed. But by 15th century, the absolute rulers tried to regain their power and have centralized power. And the aristocracy, that is the nobility, tries to oppose it. So both in England and France, we see the kings had to wage long wars against the dukes and princes to regain their power. And there was a shift in tactics of nobility in order to ensure their survival. So, along with opposing the measures of centralization, we see the nobility also tries to adjust to these new developments in order to ensure that they survive, or else they would be completely extinct or wiped off. So they quickly transformed their loyalties to the new regimes. So the nobility also tried to get adjusted to the new developments and meet the needs of the new regimes. The royal absolutism was modified form of feudalism. So now we have a new form of governance, or a new social structure, which is getting termed as royal absolutism, or absolute rule of the monarch. And to a large extent, it can be called a modified form of feudalism. It is not something which is completely different from feudal structure, but there are certain practices which are getting continued, but some practices are already omitted or given up. So in a way, it can be called as a modified form of feudalism. The class of landlords which had been powerful in the feudal system, the class of landlords, that is the nobility, continued to dominate the political scene and occupied prominent positions in the administrative services. And we call it a continuation because we don't see that the whole second order, that is nobility, is getting wiped off. Instead, they continue to remain in positions of power and now become administrators, or they become the ones who run the administration in the new political order. So we see that the new monarchs were different from previous rulers in some important ways. So what are these differences? The new monarch was the center of an elaborate courtier society, and he needed the cooperation of those who could command authority. And the monarchs patronized such people by means of money. Money became an important way by which non-aristocratic elements like merchants, traders, and bankers could gain access to the royal court. So this is an important change. So now the monarch needs support from different sections of the society to have a centralized form of government and hold power to itself. So what the monarch does is that he forges new kind of relationship with the non-aristocratic class too. So other than the nobility or the noble class, the king tries to have new relations with the sections in society which have emerged as a result of the economic changes. Those are merchants, traders, and bankers. And now they were getting access to the royal court, and the monarchs were patronizing or were giving protection to these new set of people who had emerged and who were called the fourth order. And we see that new kind of relationships are building up between the ruler and this new section, which gain influence and prominence in the 15th and 16th centuries. And they lent money to king. And the reason why the king is interested in having relations with this fourth order, that is the merchants and the traders, is that the merchants and traders are very influential and rich, and they are gaining prominence in the society. So it's from them that the king gets money, which is required to pay wages to the soldiers. So now, under the centralized army, it is important that the army is given cash, as in wage they are to be given money instead of other services. So in order to meet these needs, it is important that the king has relations or good relations with the fourth order, that is merchants and traders, who lent money to the king. And the non-feudal system thus found place in the state system. So for the first time, we see the non-feudal system comes to play an important role and forges or makes a new relation with the king. And we see that the history of England and France after 16th century was to be shaped by the above changes in power structure. So this is an important change happening in power structure. We see that new class emerged, that is the fourth order. And we also saw how the king now comes into relationship or takes interest in making a new relation with the fourth order and the benefits which king has from it. And in France, during the reign of King Louis XIII, a meeting of French Consultative Assembly called the Estates General was held. So by the 16th century, emperors like Louis XIII make an effort to call an estate general where different class orders or the different orders in the society could meet and discuss what changes they wanted. And it represented three orders, that is clergy, nobility, and the commons. And it was not summoned again for about 2 centuries because the king did not want to share powers with these three estates or orders. So although an effort is being made to know what these three orders want and what change will benefit the whole of society, but we see that this effort doesn't go far. Although the king calls for assembly, it is not continued, and it is only after 2 centuries that again such an estate general gets called. And in England, very different types of events happen. So unlike France, in event, new developments or different developments was taking place in this period. Even as early as the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon kings had a great council. So the Anglo-Saxon kings, who were the rulers of England during the 8th century, is seen to have a great council or a consultative assembly where people come together and discuss the affairs of the state. And the king had to consult this council before imposing any taxes. So this is very important. The king is not an absolute authority, but he had to consult this council before any taxes were imposed. And this great council gradually developed into what was called the parliament. So this is very important, that this is how the origin of parliament or parliamentary system happens. It is this council which then at a later time develops into something called a parliament, which the king has to consult before taking any decisions related to imposing of taxes. And it was composed of two houses. The parliament we know has two houses, the House of Lords, which had the members which were nobles and clergy. So the noble class, the second order, and the first order, the clergy, belonged to the House of Lords, and the other house was called the House of Commons, representing towns and rural areas. So this is how the representative body worked in England. Unlike in France, England had a much more participation of people, and the king was obliged to listen to the opinions of other sections. And King Charles I, an absolute ruler, ruled the country without calling the parliament for 11 years. So this is an exception, that King Charles I of England had ruled the country without calling the parliament almost for 11 years between 1629 and 40, that is in the 17th century. And ultimately, Charles was forced to call the parliament because he needed money. And now, although he tried ruling the country without calling the parliament, he was forced to do it because he was in need of money, and the cooperation of the three orders was necessary for it. A section of parliament decided to wage war against the king. The king was defeated and later executed. So the king, who was not ready to consult the council, finally had to meet this fate. That is, he was defeated and executed by the society. And the parliament now established a republic in the country. But this system did not last long. Although the parliament in England around 17th century establishes a republic, but it did not last for long. And in 1660, monarchy was restored. So, although republic, which meant people's power or people having ultimate authority over governance, but it did not last long in England, because by 1660, monarchy was restored, but on the condition that king would call the parliament regularly. So still, the king had the obligation to consider the opinions of other sections of the society, mainly the three orders. So this is how the case of England was different from what happened in France. To a large extent, people had some say over the matters related to governance and especially tax.